Thank you to Tony especially for reading that really long reading, but as he said, what a wonderful story. This very familiar story of David and Goliath. But the title I want to give it today is Let No One's Heart Fail. I recently read a really good article on the case for not sanitizing fairy tales. In other words, not leaving out the gruesome, scary bits or softening them. And Tony definitely did not leave any gruesome bits out for us today. Did you know that in the original version of Cinderella, her stepsisters chop off their heels and their toes to fit their bloody, mutilated feet into the glass slipper in greedy pursuit of the throne? Disney left that bit out, didn't they? And the article raises this very important question. What is it that equips children and adults for dragons and death? This question is already wrestled with by most parents, teachers, psychologists. And G.K. Chesterton famously wrote, "The baby has known the dragon intimately ever since she had an imagination." We've always known all along that there is darkness. And I think anxiety rampantly exists, at least in part among us, because we do not know how to face dragons, and we are unable to fully deny their existence, which is one of our greatest tactics. Chesterton argues in his case for fairy tales, with the gruesome bits left in, that what the fairy tale provides for the child is a St. George to kill the dragon, which, the author argues, is a far greater gift than any amount of sanitizing away the evil. We do our children no favors by trying to convince them that darkness does not exist, or that it won't come near them, or that it won't be at work through us. Children are far too smart for that, and so are you. Today's story feels somewhat like the stuff of fairy tales, though a fairy tale it is not. But we're going to need the courage of a child to turn the page and see what happens next without shying away from the lurking dragons, or in this case, giants. Now, that might feel like I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but I'm really not, so I hope you'll stick with me. If you read through the book of Samuel, you'll quickly see that this is not the first time that these two nations have lined up against each other, preparing for battle. The Philistines are long-time enemies of the Israelites. There has been this huge, long history of winning and losing and playing dirty on both sides. A recent tactic of the Philistines was to rid the Hebrew people of their blacksmiths so that they couldn't make their own swords or spears, and then they would charge exorbitant prices themselves. As a result, often the Israelites are without weapons, apart from King Saul and his son Jonathan. So here we are, bigger and better equipped with weapons. The Philistines have the clear advantage, not least because of their lethal weapon, Goliath, the great 10-feet-high warrior, who from outside sources, it seems, is the one who had killed the prophet Eli's sons and the one who had the gall to steal the Ark of the Covenant, the very presence of God. You can read about this in Samuel. It's a crazy story. And that was an incident that did not end well for the Philistines. But Goliath definitely has utter disregard for the Israelites and their God. He is not afraid of either, and he will show no mercy. And so this Goliath makes a proposal. Instead of one army against an army, how about one representative against one representative? Now, this proposal in itself is a taunt against Israel, exposing their lack of weapons and exposing their failing king. Because in Israel's fairly recent past, they had acquired their very first king, the very one who should be out here right now facing Goliath, but he's not. The promising King Saul has crumbled lately, and word has gotten around. And it began because the Israelite people were unsatisfied with being led by God through the prophet Samuel. They had demanded their own king. Chapter 8, they said, "We are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations. What a dangerous desire. So that we also may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. A king was what they wanted, a king was what they got. But King Saul was far from going out before them to fight their battles. King Saul was terrified. The once promising, tall, handsome young man who stood head and shoulders above everyone else is now old and it seems going a little mad. The loss of his kingship and his kingdom has been foretold by the prophet Samuel, because Saul has proved again and again to be a man who does not heed the voice of God in the leading of his people. Samuel tells him in chapter 13, "You have done foolishly, Saul. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him to be ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you, Saul." Israel's desire for a king and putting their hope in this King Saul has been proving disastrous. Saul had recently been so troubled by tormenting spirits that he hired a local shepherd boy who was also a skilled musician to play the harp for him to ease his suffering. Saul loved this boy, or at least what he gave to him, and in fact made him his armor bearer, which was an office of great significance. This young shepherd's name was David, and although Saul does not know it, it is of course the very David who will be his successor. In fact, and this is important, right before this battle today that Tony read for us, David has already been appointed by God and anointed by Samuel as king. But his kingship has not been made public, and it has not yet fully come into being. As far as they're concerned, Saul is technically still king, and yet here he is, nothing like a king. Saul is afraid of Goliath just like everyone else, and Goliath knows it. So, the big question is, who is going to represent Israel in the battle against Goliath? For 40 days, they camp on their mountain. For 40 days, Goliath comes out to taunt them. For 40 days, they are dismayed and greatly afraid. For 40 days, no one comes out to represent the Israelites in battle against Goliath. Now, this idea of representation is an important one for all. Goliath here in this story is representing the army of the Philistines, and therefore he is representing the whole Philistine nation. He is representing, it could be said, all that the Philistine nation are about at this time: power, force, strength, weaponry, and so on. But I want you to think even more wide lens today, because I want to propose to you that the much greater thing that Goliath symbolizes and represents in this story is chaos and destruction itself. Here comes the dragon, okay? Because there's kind of two stories being told here. There's a surface story and there's a deeper one. Now, this is not immediately obvious, but the Bible often uses imagery of giants or serpents or sea serpents to depict chaos and destructive forces. The first time that we see this is in Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden, where the serpent figure introduces destruction and chaos into creation. And those images would have been prevalent among the cultural narratives, the mythology, and the poetry in the nations all around Israel. The serpent represents and enacts chaos, disorder, and destruction, okay? But here in this story, there is a link made between the giant Goliath and the serpent. Now, it's hard to see from our English translation, but this big, strong, gruesome warrior, and in particular the detailed description of his armor in the original Hebrew, is code for snake, like. Now, this link would have been obvious to the original hearers, but for us it gets lost in translation. But Goliath's bronze helmet is spelled with the root letters of the word snake. And he was clothed with an armor of scales, which is in the Hebrew is the exact same word used to describe the scales of sea creatures or a sea serpent. So it's given us this picture that Goliath is clothed like a snake. So through this play on words, there is a link made between Goliath and the snake. He's this snaky giant, if you like. And obviously the Hebrew reader would have spotted this much easier than we do, but they would have understood this link between Goliath and the snake to be symbolic of chaos and destruction. Now, this might seem too far-fetched for now, and that's fine. You don't have to go there. But I want you to hold on to that idea for a little bit as we think about this story. At the very least, it is fair to say that the Israelites experience Goliath as a terrifying, destructive force that threatens them. They feel that there's no way that they won't be swallowed up by this guy. As Lorraine said, every single one of them feels inadequate and ill-equipped before Goliath. But then enters David. David so quietly dropped into the story. This young shepherd sent by his father to bring lunch to his big brothers who have followed Saul into battle camp. Their father wants word of what's going on. He wants to know his boys are okay. And David arrives just as the armies are going out to their battle lines. He runs to his brothers and he greets them, and as he does so, Goliath makes his daily appearance. Again, he shouts his challenge as before, and David watches as the Israelites run away from Goliath afraid. Now, David, already in this moment of hearing Goliath, knows that Goliath will be defeated. David's victory lies here in this moment. Because David understands that Goliath is defying not the armies of the living God, David understands that Goliath is not defying the armies of the great King Saul, but the armies of the living God. And he knows that God will glorify his own name. David has not lost sight of who the Israelites' true king is. And so word gets back to Saul of David's take on the situation, and he is summoned to the king. And there David says to Saul these beautiful words, "Let no one's heart fail because of Goliath. Let no one's heart fail because of Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." This would have been such beautiful and good news to these terrified and overwhelmed people. At first, Saul can't hear it. He says, "You're not able, you're just a boy." And he says, "Goliath is a long-time warrior. In other words, you're nothing compared to him." And David says, "Look, I've had my fair share of battles too. I'm a shepherd, remember? Many a lion or bear I've had to fight to rescue my lambs. I've killed both lions and bears to rescue the lamb from its mouth. And this Philistine will be like one of those lions and bears." And here's why, verse 37. "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." And there it is. David understands his past victories and his future victories not as attributed to his own fighting ability, not as attributed to his own bravery, or even, dare I say, faith, but to the Lord who saved him again and again as he fought to save the lambs. So Saul says, "Go, off you go, and may the Lord be with you." And then King Saul clothes David. Remember, David is the armor bearer to Saul, and now the roles are reversed, and Saul becomes David's armor bearer. This is a very, very significant symbolic moment of kingship. Of course, we all know Saul's armor is much too big and cumbersome for the shepherd boy. He takes the armor off, he does all that he knows, he picks up 5 stones, puts them in his pocket, and heads towards Goliath. Now, David is an immediate offense to Goliath. Goliath wants a worthy battle to show off his strength, but instead they send him this ruddy boy with a stick and a few stones. David looks at Goliath coming towards him and disdains him. David isn't even worthy of his consideration. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" he says, and he curses David by his gods. "Come here till I give your flesh to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the field," says Goliath. But David says, "You think you're mightier because you have swords and javelins, the powers of this world. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head and give the dead bodies of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals. So that, says David, all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. They charge towards each other. David puts his hand in his pocket, takes out a stone, slings it, strikes the giant on his forehead, and Goliath falls face down on the ground. David has no sword of his own. This is the bit that Disney leaves out, by the way. David has no sword of his own. He runs over to Goliath, takes Goliath's sword, draws it out of his sheath, kills Goliath with it, and cuts off Goliath's head. Now, I want you to pay attention to this particular scene. The giant, the snaky giant, remember, face down in the dust, where the shepherd king crushes his head. There is a lot of symbolism here in this scene. Remember God's promise to the serpent in the Garden of Eden, you will crawl on your belly and eat dust, and the offspring of the woman will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. This scene, and maybe in particular Goliath's falling forwards and not backwards, is a nod to the serpent in the Garden of Eden and to the cross where Satan's head is ultimately crushed. Seeing Goliath dead, the Philistines flee and the Israelites pursue them as far as Gath. Saul, watching it, has only one question. Whose son is this young man? A question that Saul has never thought to ask before, even though David was much valued by him. David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And so the story ends. Now, there are so many valid ways that we could conclude this sermon. This is a familiar childhood story to many of us, and you've probably heard many sermons on it. Things like, don't let anyone tell you you're only a youth. Trust in the Lord as you face your giants. What are your 5 stones of faith? You need only be yourself, etc. These are all reasonable enough. But I think as I've tried to hear this story afresh over the past couple of months, I've been wondering about one particular question. Where should we locate ourselves in this story? Because the most common option is to locate ourselves in David. We are encouraged so often to be a person of faith who does courageous things, trusting God to help him. Perhaps that's what you're expecting to hear right now. Or we might more soberingly be encouraged to see ourselves in Saul, to think about the ways that we have stopped listening to the voice of God in our lives. Now, if we locate ourselves in David, we are kind of mustered into bravery. If we locate ourselves in Saul, we are kind of mustered into caution. Which one of these do we do? But what if that isn't the point of the story? Could it be that this story is given to us for reasons much greater than to learn the art of bravery or caution? I want to propose to you today that this story is given to us as an invitation to our greatest hope. Because there's at least one more way that we can locate ourselves in this story, and it's the one I propose for us today. And that is that we locate ourselves among the bunch of frightened Israelites. Here, among the frightened Israelites who are helpless before this giant of chaos, helpless before the destructive force that threatens them. This certainly feels truer of my heart. All I have to do is read the news to feel like a child facing a dragon. And when we locate ourselves among these frightened, anxious Israelites, this story, I think, begins to work on us much the same way that a fairy tale does for the child. It invites us to hope. It invites us to believe, that impossible things can happen. That impossible things have happened. Because through no doing of their own, these frightened Israelites received the unexpected gift of a shepherd king who was willing to sacrifice himself so they didn't have to, and on their behalf as their representative. We can hope because along with these frightened Israelites, we can witness the impossible defeat of a giant, the chaos-stirring snake who lost his head in the end, which signifies the absolute destruction of his power to harm. All the best fairy tales give us imagination for the truest story, the one that always feels too good to be true, but is true nonetheless. The story of David and Goliath is like that. It is not a fairy tale, but it does help us to acknowledge what we have known all along, that there is darkness, that there is chaos, that there is destruction around us so great that we are powerless to stop it. And yet, there is a St. George to kill the dragon. There is a shepherd boy to kill a giant. And there is a shepherd king who defeats the serpent. I hope that by now you can see how the story of David and Goliath points backwards towards the serpent in the Garden of Eden and points forwards towards the true shepherd king, King Jesus, and his ultimate defeat of death and chaos and destruction. He did this like David through the sacrificing of himself for the rescue of his lambs. I think this story lifts our hearts in hope towards that shepherd king, whose sacrifice and representation of us was once and for all, one for all and once for all. And it's because of this that we really can stand with these frightened Israelites. And in our anxiety, we can receive David's words as gifts to ourselves right here, right now in this place. Let no one's heart fail because of Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. This is the equipping that our scared child selves need. Let no one's heart fail because of death and chaos and sin or foxes. Your servant, Jesus Christ, will go and fight with the serpent. These destructive powers that frighten us have been defeated in Christ, and they shall not have the final word. And because of that, I don't need to be David, I need only give thanks for him. And because of this, I don't need to fear being Saul, because my shepherd has defeated the serpent and rescued me from his mouth. We need not be afraid any longer. So let no one's heart fail, not one of you. Because your servant, Jesus Christ, your King, has fought and died and risen again. And in so doing, he has defeated the serpent once and for all. The universe will ultimately be set right. That is the last word. And he has won this victory not with sword or spear, not with the powers of this world, but through the sacrificial giving of himself for us in love. And so, just like Saul, the only question left, and really the only one that matters, after we have witnessed this man, Jesus, on a cross, slaying the serpent, is whose son is this man? Because the answer to that question is the one that welcomes every single one of us into the greatest and truest fairy tale there ever was. The answer to that question changes everything. Amen.